Chapter 2. Nevernight. Nevernight was a slender obsidian pyramid with no windows. It was taller than the bright buildings around it, and from a distance, looked like a disruption in the fabric of the city. The tower could be seen from anywhere in New Athens. Demeter believed and often said that the only reason Hades built the tower so tall was to remind mortals of their finite life. Persephone was beginning to grow anxious the longer she stood in the shadow of Hades' club. Lexa had gone to talk to a couple of girls she recognized from school up the line, leaving her to hold their place alone. She was out of her element, surrounded by strangers, preparing to enter another god's territory, and wearing a sexy yet revealing dress. She found herself folding and unfolding her arms, unable to decide if she wanted to hide the low cut of the outfit or embrace it. She'd borrowed the pink sparkly number from Lexa, who was far less shapely. Her hair fell in loose curls around her face, and Lexa had applied minimal makeup to show off Persephone's natural beauty. If her mother saw her now, she'd send her right back to the greenhouse, or as Persephone had come to refer to it, the glass prison. That thought sent her stomach into a spiral. She looked around, wondering if Demeter's spies were about.
Had her threat to the waitress at the coffee house been enough to keep the girl silent about her plans with Lexa? Since she'd told her best friend she'd come tonight, her imagination had run wild with all the ways Demeter might punish her if she were caught. Despite her mother's nurturing ways, she was a vengeful punisher. In fact, Demeter had a whole plot in the greenhouse dedicated to punishment. Every flower that grew there had been a nymph, a king, a creature that had incurred her wrath. It was that wrath that made her paranoid and had her checking every mirror in her house when she'd returned to the apartment earlier. Oh my gods! Lexa was a vision in red, and eyes tracked her as she returned to Persephone's side. Isn't it gorgeous? Persephone almost laughed. She wasn't as impressed with the grandeur of the gods. She felt that if they could flaunt their wealth, immortality and power, the least they could do was help humanity. Instead, the gods spent their time pitting mortal against mortal and destroying and reforming the world for fun. Persephone looked up at the tower again and frowned. Black's not really my color. You'll sing a different tune when you lay eyes on Hades, Lexa said. Persephone glared at her roommate. You told me he wasn't here. Lexa placed her hands on Persephone's shoulders and looked her in the eyes. Persephone, don't get me wrong, you're hot and all, but what are the actual odds you'll catch Hades' attention? This place is packed. Lexa had a point, and yet, what if her glamour failed? Her horns would catch Hades' attention. There was no way he'd pass up the chance to confront another god on his premises, especially one he's never met. Persephone's stomach knotted, and she fidgeted with her hair and smoothed her dress. She wasn't aware that Lexa was watching her until she said, you can just be honest and admit you'd like to meet him. Persephone's laughter was shaky. I don't want to meet Hades. She wasn't sure why it was so hard to say she was interested, but she couldn't bring herself to admit that she might actually want to meet the god. Lexa gave her a knowing look, but before her best friend could say anything, shouts came from the front of the line. Persephone peeked around to get a look at what was going on. A man tried to take a swing at a large ogre guarding the entrance to the club. It was a terrible idea. They were notoriously ruthless and brutal. The ogre didn't even blink as his hand closed down on the man's wrist. Out of the shadows, 2 more ogres emerged. They were large and dressed in black. They grabbed the man and dragged him away down the sidewalk. No, wait, please, I just need her back. It was a long while before Persephone could no longer hear his voice. Beside her, Lexa sighed. There's always one. Persephone looked at her, questioningly. Lexa shrugged. What? There's always a story in the Delphi Divine about some mortal trying to break into the underworld to rescue their loved ones. The Delphi Divine was Lexa's favorite gossip magazine. There were few things that rivaled Lexa's obsession with the gods, except maybe fashion. But that's impossible. Everyone knew Hades was notorious for enforcing the borders of his realm. No soul in and no soul out without his knowledge. Persephone had a feeling it was the same for his club, and that thought sent shivers down her spine. Doesn't keep people from trying, Lexa said. When she and Lexa came under the gaze of the ogre, Persephone felt exposed. One glance at the creature's beady eyes, and she almost called it quits there. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and tried to avoid looking at the monster's misshapen face for too long. It was covered in boils, and it had an underbite that exposed razor-sharp yellow teeth. She wasn't worried if the creature could see through her glamour. Her mother's magic surpassed that of the ogre's. Lexa gave her name, and the ogre paused as he spoke into a mic. After a moment, he reached forward and pulled open the door to Nevernight. Persephone was surprised to find that the small space they entered was dim and silent and filled with two more ogres. She recognized them from earlier when they'd dragged the man away from the club. The ogres raked their gazes over Lexa and Persephone and then asked, "Purses?" They opened their clutches so the two could check for prohibited materials, including phones and cameras. The one rule at Nevernight was that photos were forbidden. In fact, Hades had this rule for any event he attended. How would Hades even know if some curious mortal snapped a photo? Persephone had asked Lexa earlier when she'd explained the rule. "I have no idea how he knows," Lexa admitted. "I just know that he does, and the consequences aren't worth it." "What are the consequences?" "A broken phone, blackballed from Nevernight, and a write-up in a gossip magazine." Persephone cringed. Hades was serious, and she guessed that made sense. The god was notoriously private. He hadn't even been linked to a lover. Persephone doubted Hades had taken a vow of chastity like Artemis and Athena, and yet he managed to stay out of the public eye. She sort of admired that about him. Once they were cleared, the ogres opened another set of doors. Lexa grabbed Persephone's hand and pulled her through. A blast of cool air hit her, carrying the scent of spirits, sweat, and something akin to bitter oranges. Narcissus, Persephone recognized the scent. The goddess of spring found herself on a balcony overlooking the floor of the club. There were people everywhere, crowded around tables playing cards and drinking, at the bar shoulder to shoulder, their silhouettes ignited by a red backlight. Several plush booths were arranged in cozy settings and packed with people, but it was the center of the club that drew Persephone's attention. A sunken dance floor held bodies like water in a basin. People move against each other in a mesmerizing rhythm under a stream of red light. Overhead, the ceiling was lined with crystal and wrought iron chandeliers. "Come on!" Lexa pulled Persephone down a set of stairs that led to the ground floor. She held on tight to Lexa's hand, afraid she would lose her as they wove through the crowd. It took her a moment to figure out which direction her friend was going, but they soon found themselves at the bar. They squeezed into a space only big enough for one person. "2 Manhattans," Lexa ordered. Just as she reached for her clutch, an arm snaked between them and threw down a few dollars. A voice followed, "Drinks on me!" Lexa and Persephone turned to find a man standing behind them. He had a jawline as sharp as a diamond and a head of thick curly hair. It was as dark as his eyes, and his skin was a beautiful burnished brown. He was one of the most handsome men Persephone had ever seen. "Thanks," Lexa breathed. "No problem," he said, flashing a set of pretty white teeth. A welcome sight compared to the ogre's grisly fangs. "First time at Nevernight?" Lexa answered quickly. "Yes, you?" "Oh, I'm a regular here," he said. Persephone glanced at Lexa, who blurted exactly what Persephone was thinking. "How?" The man offered a warm laugh. "Just lucky, I guess," he said and extended his hand. "Adonis." He shook Lexa's hand and then Persephone's. "Would you like to join my table?" Adonis asked. "Sure," they said in unison, feeling giddy. With their drinks in hand, Persephone and Lexa follow Adonis to one of the booths they had seen from the balcony. Each area had 2 crescent-shaped velvet couches with a table between them. There were already several people there, 6 guys and 5 girls, but they shifted so Lexa and Persephone could have a seat. "All, this is Lexa and Persephone." Adonis pointed to his group of friends, saying names, but Persephone only caught those who were closest to her, Aro, Zeres, and Sybil. Aro and Zeres looked like siblings. They both had ginger hair, a spray of freckles, pretty blue eyes, and the same willow-thin body. She soon found out they were twins. Sybil was blonde and beautiful. She had long legs and wore a simple white dress. She sat between the twins and leaned over Aro to speak to them. "Where are you all from?" she asked. "Ionia," Lexa said. "Olympia," Persephone said. The girl's eyes widened. "You lived in Olympia? I bet it was beautiful." Persephone had lived far, far away from the city proper in her mother's glass greenhouse and hadn't seen much of Olympia. It was one of the most popular tourist destinations in New Greece. It was where the gods held council and had sprawling estates. When the divine were away, many of the mansions and surrounding gardens were open to tour. "It was beautiful," Persephone said, "but New Athens is beautiful too. I didn't really have much freedom there." Sybil seemed to understand. "Parents?" Persephone nodded. She learned the boys and Sybil were from New Delphi and also attended New Athens University like she and Lexa. "What are you studying?" Persephone asked. "Architecture," the boys said in unison, which meant they were in the College of Hestia. "I'm in the College of the Divine," Sybil said. "Sybil is an oracle," Aro said, pointing to her with his thumb. The girl blushed and averted her eyes. "That means you will serve a god," Lexa said, eyes wide. Oracles were coveted positions among mortals, and to become one, they had to be born with certain prophetic gifts. Oracles acted as messengers for the gods. In ancient times, that meant serving in temples. Now it meant serving as their press manager. Oracles gave statements and organized press circuits, especially when a god had something prophetic to communicate. "Apollo's already got his eye on her." Sybil rolled her eyes. "It's not as wonderful as it sounds. My family was not happy." Sybil didn't need to say it for Persephone to understand. Her parents were what the faithful and the God-fearing called impious. The impious were a group of mortals who rejected the gods when they came to earth. Having already felt abandoned by them, they were not eager to obey. There was a revolt, and two sides were born. Even the gods who supported the impious used mortals like puppets, dragging them across battlefields. There was destruction and chaos reigned. After a year of fighting, the battle was over. The gods had promised a new life, something better than Elysium. Apparently, Hades didn't like that too well. But the gods delivered. They threaded together continents and duppered the new landmass New Greece, splicing it into territories with great, gleaming cities. "My parents would have been ecstatic," Lexa said. Persephone met Sybil's gaze. "I'm sorry they weren't excited for you." She shrugged. "It's better now that I'm here." The goddess got the feeling that she and Sybil had a lot in common when it came to their parents. Several shots later, the conversation lapsed into hilarious stories of the trio's friendship, and Persephone became distracted by her surroundings. She noticed small details, like strands of tiny lights overhead that looked like stars in the dark above, single-stemmed narcissus on the tables at each booth, and the wrought-iron rails of the second-story balcony where a lone figure loomed. That's where her gaze stayed, meeting a pair of shadowy eyes. Had she thought earlier that Adonis was the most handsome man she'd ever seen? She'd been wrong. That man was now staring at her. She couldn't tell the color of his eyes, but they ignited a fire under her skin, and it was like he knew because his full lips curved into a harsh smile, drawing attention to his strong jaw, covered in dark stubble. He was big, well over 6.5 feet tall, and dressed in darkness from his inky hair to his black suit. Her throat went dry, and she was suddenly uncomfortable. She fidgeted and crossed her legs, instantly regretted the move because the man's gaze fell there and held for a moment before sliding back up her frame, snagging on her curves. The fire he'd ignited under her skin pooled low in her stomach, reminding her of how empty she felt, how desperately she needed to be filled up. She considered his question and then said, "It seemed rebellious at the time. And now you aren't so sure?" "Oh, I am sure it is rebellious," Persephone said. She dragged her finger along the surface of the table. "I'm just not sure how I'll feel about it tomorrow." "Who are you rebelling against?" She looked at him and smiled. "You said one question." His smile matched hers, and it made her heart beat harder in her chest. So I did. Staring back at those endless eyes, she felt he could see her, not the glamour or even her skin and bones, but the core of her, and it made her shiver. "Are you cold?" he asked. "What?" "You've been shivering a lot since you sat down," he observed. She felt her face redden, and she suddenly blurted, "Who was that woman with you earlier?" He looked confused for a moment and then said, "Oh, Minthy. She's always putting her hands where they don't belong." Persephone paled. "I think I should go." He stopped her with a hand on hers. His touch was electric, and she gasped at the contact, pulling away quickly. "No," he said, almost commanding, and Persephone glared at him. "Excuse me?" "What I mean to say is, I haven't taught you how to play yet." His voice lowered, and it was mesmerizing. "Allow me." It was a mistake to hold his gaze because it was impossible to say no. She swallowed and managed to relax. "Then teach me." His eyes burned into her before falling to the cards. He shuffled them, explaining, "This is poker." She noted that he had graceful hands and long fingers. "Did he play piano?" "We will play 5-card draw, and we'll start with a bet." Persephone looked down at herself. She hadn't brought her clutch, but the man was quick to say, "A question answered then. If I win, you will answer any question I pose, and if you win, I will answer yours." Persephone grimaced. She knew what he was going to ask, but answering questions was far better than losing all her money and her soul. So she said, "Deal." Those sensual lips curled into a smile, which deepened lines on his face that only made him look more attractive. Who was this man? She guessed she could ask his name, but she wasn't interested in making friends at Nevernight. The man explained that, in poker, there were 10 different rankings, the lowest being the high card and the highest being the royal flush. The goal was to draw a higher rank than the other player. He explained other things like checking, folding, and bluffing. Sometimes poker is just a game of deception, especially when you're losing. Hades dealt each of them 5 cards. Persephone looked at her hand and tried to remember what Hades had said about the different ranks. She laid her cards down, face up, and the man did the same. "You have a pair of queens," he said, "and I have a full house." "So, you win?" she said. "Yes," he replied, and then claimed his prize immediately. "Who are you rebelling against?" She smiled wryly. "My mother." He raised a brow. "Why?" "You'll have to win another hand if I'm going to answer." So he dealt another and won again. This time he didn't ask the question, just looked at her expectantly. She sighed. "Because she made me mad." He stared at her, waiting, and she smiled. "You never said the answer had to be detailed." His grin matched hers. "Noted for the future, I assure you." "The future? Well, I hope this isn't the last time we'll play poker." Butterflies erupted in her stomach. She should tell him this was the first and final time she would come to Nevernight. He dealt again and won. Persephone was getting tired of losing and answering this man's questions. Why was he so interested in her anyway? Where was that woman he'd been with earlier? "Why are you angry with your mother?" She considered this question for a moment and then said, "Because she wants me to be something I cannot." Persephone dropped her gaze to the cards and then said, "I don't understand why people do this." He tilted his head as if questioning. "You are not enjoying our game?" "I am," she said. "But I don't understand why people play Hades. Why do they want to sell their soul to him?" "They don't agree to a game because they want to sell their soul," he said. "They do it because they think they can win." "Do they? Win?" "Sometimes." "Does that anger him, you think?" The question was meant to remain a thought in her head, and yet the words slipped out between her lips. He smirked, and she could feel it deep in her gut. "Darling, I win either way." Her eyes went wide, and her heart stuttered. She stood quickly, and his name slipped out of her mouth like a curse. Hades. His name on her lips seemed to have an effect on him, but she couldn't tell if it was good or bad. His eyes darkened, and his smile lines melted into a hard, unreadable mask. "I have to go." She spun and left the small room. This time, she didn't let him stop her. She hurried down the winding steps and plunged into the mass of bodies on the main floor. All the while, she was highly aware of the spot on her wrist where Hades' fingers had touched her skin. Was it an exaggeration to say it burned? It took her a while to find the exit, and when she did, she pushed through the doors. Outside, she took a few deep breaths and then let the force of what she'd done hit her. She'd allowed Hades, the god of the underworld, to instruct her, to touch her, to play her, and question her. And he had won. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part is that there was a side of her, a side she'd never know existed until tonight. That wanted to run back inside, find him, and demand a lesson in the anatomy of his body.